And I want to share with you a really important media story that many of you have asked about. And it also has a very unique history in the United States, and that is presidential endorsements by major newspapers. We've talked a little bit about celebrity endorsements, and there's been no qualitative ways of showing whether or not these celebrity endorsements, whether they're actors or actresses, athletes, anyone famous, really moves the needle at all. And that can also be true of media endorsements. There has never been, to my knowledge, a newspaper endorsement that has suddenly shifted the election. But we also know that newspapers were more powerful at another time than, let's say, a podcast. But just even talking about Joe Rogan's numbers, you can see the power dynamics in the media landscape have changed. So here's something before we get into the news about endorsements. I just want to give you a couple kind of interesting facts about them. One of the first endorsements that we know of happened by the New York Times in 1860, October 11th, actually, 1860. And that was an endorsement of President Lincoln. If you look over the course of endorsements, and by the way, the data is not awesome, but if you look at the data that's really been collected from the 1970s on, in general, the trend line was more Republican endorsements if you were looking at a group of different newspapers. And it depends on what that group is. Sometimes that could be several hundred newspapers. And if you look at the more recent data, it's usually the top 100 in the country. And how that's determined is probably by circulation, but 100 is a lot. I probably can name some of the big newspapers, probably get a handful of names. But that wasn't always the way in the past. So they're looking at these sort of collections of newspapers. And again, the data that we get is only as good as the data that we're looking at. So it's just a reminder of that. But the trend line was that we actually saw more Republican endorsements by papers in the United States until about the mid 2000s. And then it shifted. And in fact, I can show you, let me see if I could pull this up. I can actually show you what this looks like. This would be great to show you. This is actually, let me see here. Um, what we're going to look at is the endorsements just in 2020. And so this gives you an example of some editorial endorsements. Remember, when we're talking about newspaper endorsements, we're talking about editorial pages. So these are the op-ed pages in the newspaper, not the front page of the newspaper, but the oftentimes the elite writers of the newspaper are those that write editorials. They're weighing in on different topics. The reporters are doing the hard work, running away every single day of making sure you're aware of what's going on. And then you have the editorialists that are going to give you a point of view on it. Oftentimes, there is a dividing line between these two groups. It's often referred to as sort of the dividing line of church and state. They're often put in even in different areas of a newsroom. They can't all be together, but they can be put in different areas and thought of in different ways by the newspaper themselves. Editorial pages often have personalities. The Wall Street Journal editorial page or political alignments, personalities and political alignments, meaning personalities in that they can, sometimes there's editorial pages that use humor. There are different writers that have a certain point of view or a voice that are sort of developed through these editorial pages. And then they can have their own political leanings as an editorial page overall. The Wall Street Journal, political leaning overall is conservative. The New York Times, political leaning is more progressive. Here is a look at the editorial endorsements last time around for the 2020 election. We're looking at the top 100 newspapers. Again, the trend line, if you go back to the 1970s, more Republican endorsements. Then as we get into the mid 2000s, more Democrat endorsements. And then at 2020, we see 47 total endorsements for President Biden and 7 endorsements for President Trump. 47 to 7. And you say, well, wait, that doesn't add up to 100. Well, 44 newspapers did not endorse anybody. And that's an important trend line that you should know that's really going to add to our story. The trend line, after going towards more Republican and then more Democrat, is that there seems to be a trend of fewer endorsements by newspapers. So, something to consider as we take in this headline. And the headline is that the Washington Post, a major newspaper in the United States, announced on Friday that they would not endorse a political candidate. This was big news for some, particularly the Washington Post journalists, as well as the editorial page, where apparently, according to reports, there was already an endorsement written for Vice President Harris. This is the first time in more than 30 years that the newspaper has not endorsed a political candidate. And the timing of the announcement was something that caught the attention of not only the writers in the Washington Post, but others, because it's so close to the election. The impression was that this was happening because of the recent movements of different campaigns. I'm going to pause there, but because I want to, before I get to some of the critique of what the Washington Post did, I want to read to you from the actual editorial that was released by the publisher of the paper, William Lewis. This is an opinion on political endorsements. It starts off: the Washington Post will not be making an endorsement of a presidential election in this, The Washington Post will not be making an endorsement of a presidential candidate in this election, nor in any future presidential election. We are returning to our roots of not endorsing presidential candidates. And it goes on to kind of give a little history of the paper and what they did and what they didn't. When they stepped back in and when they decided to step back out. And it was a little bit choppy. The endorsements from the newspaper weren't always happening. They've just always been happening for the last 3 decades. It's this paragraph at the end that I think is important for you to hear. Quote, "We recognize that this will be read in a range of ways, including as a tacit endorsement of one candidate, or as a condemnation of another, or as an abdication of responsibility. That is inevitable. We don't see it that way. We see it as consistent with the values the Post has always stood for and what we hope for in a leader: character and courage in service to the American ethic, veneration for the rule of law, and respect for human freedom in all its aspects. We also see it as a statement in support of our readers' ability to make up their own minds on this, the most consequential of American decisions: whom to vote for as the next president. Our job at the Washington Post is to provide, through the newsroom, nonpartisan news for all Americans and thought-provoking reported views from our opinion team to help our readers make up their own minds. Most of all, our job as the newspaper of the capital city of the most important country in the world is to be independent. And that is what we are and will be." Quite a strong statement. So what do you think the reaction was to this? What do you think? We want our readers to make up their own minds. I think it's important to be independent. We didn't endorse in the past. We're not going to endorse. Now we're going to go back to this. It's really important for us because we want to help our readers. What do you think the reaction was? It was met with outrage by the Washington Post, by many. I don't want to I haven't talked to every single journalist in the newsroom, but many of the prominent journalists, as well as the op-ed columnists, were furious at this. They were furious at this, and they said it was the sort of reasoning was, oh, former President Trump looks better in the polling, and therefore this is a strategic move by this newspaper to not ruffle any feathers in case he wins. That's not what was said by the publisher, but that's what was read by some. I also want to add in that one of the key columnists said it was not the issue about endorsements that mattered to her. It was the timing. She felt that they should have come out, months ago and stated this, but because it's happening within this time frame, it looks political. And that's a really interesting point. We've talked about timing and how really any stories that come out between now and the election are just going to look political, even if they're not. I want you to hear from one of the more famous columnists that is part of the Washington Post, or was, because he resigned in the aftermath of this. Take a listen.
By someone who has resigned from his position at the Washington Post in response to that decision. Robert Kagan is a senior fellow of foreign policy at the Brookings Institution. He's a former editor-at-large at the Washington Post. He's the author of the book Rebellion: How Anti-Liberalism is Tearing America Apart Again. Robert, it's great to have you here. Thank you. I just want to warn you, we're monitoring Kamala Harris's movements in Philadelphia, so I may just need to dip in if she starts talking to reporters for a moment, but this is a really important conversation. And you heard the conversation I just had with Marty Barron, that it is a bit of a betrayal. I mean, as Jonathan Capehart said, the Washington Post really leaned into the idea that democracy dies in darkness, kind of dies in silence, too.
Yes, and we can have a discussion about what whether newspapers should endorse or not endorse. Is an interesting conversation, but I think what the really important thing to see here is this is how American institutions fail to protect us. The Washington Post is one of those institutions. It represents the free press in this country, and we are seeing now, I think, a preview of coming attractions of what things are going to be like in a Donald Trump presidency. The bullying of the media and the acquiescence of the media to Donald Trump's wishes. This was a preemptive capitulation on the part of Jeff Bezos for purely business reasons. I think it's very clear what his motives were.
Preemptive capitulation. Jeff Bezos owns the Washington Post. He wasn't included in the publisher's editorial. And after this commentary, by the way, Jeff Bezos said, I wasn't involved in this decision. That's what he says. I mean, we don't know. That's how this is being viewed through this lens, though, a political capitulation and a surrendering of protecting the American public from what? From a different opinion? What do you think? Is it failing to protect you? Do you feel less protected by a lack of political endorsement by a major newspaper? How do you feel about that? Do you care about the endorsements from newspapers? Are you surprised by any of their political leanings? Have you been surprised in the past by some of their endorsements or not? And has that changed things for you? Very curious. In a survey taken a couple years ago, the overwhelming response was that newspaper endorsements did not matter to voters at all. And I'm sort of fascinated by this reaction by the newsroom, because if there was any other reason given by the publisher on the record, maybe I could see it. But with the newspaper wanting to be nonpartisan in a hyper-partisan environment where it already has a reputation for being anti former President Trump, I can't, and really wanting to help the audience make up their own minds by not weighing in, I'm struck by the vitriol by these journalists coming at their employer. I never was a part of any sort of endorsement, so it wouldn't have even crossed my mind. But the anger that they feel, and what I think it shows, is the problem with the American press today and the American press's perception of themselves and their role as part of a free press. So here's a couple of my thoughts on this. My job is not to protect you. It's to inform you. Empowerment comes through information, not commentary. If I care about you and I want to make sure you have what you need in your busy life to make up your own mind, that's what I'm going to prioritize. It's because I trust you and I respect you to know what's best for your family. It's because I trust and respect you to know what's best for your family. I'm not here to protect you. I'm here to empower you so that you can protect yourself, whatever that looks like for you. My job is not to fight for a president or a policy. It's to report thoroughly on a topic so you can fight for a president or for a policy. Because the power in the United States is with the people. It's not with the press or with the political class. It's the people that make the change, that make the decisions. This is why a free press matters for free people. You should have all the many angles of a story at your fingertips so you can chart your own course. You can advocate for your own positions, and that will help you live more and more free. That's the goal. The priority is that a free press is here to help support a free people to live the life and the story that they believe they should live. That's what makes us revolutionary in this world, on the planet. That doesn't exist everywhere. It's that self-determination that the press is there to support. The minute the press takes its eyes off of the people and turns inward, which happens a whole bunch, that's often driven by an overinflated sense of self. I know it. I've seen it, probably participated in it from time to time. It's really easy to be seduced by celebrity in the press. You got to ward off against it because that self-importance will blind you to prioritizing the people. And it's very easy to lose your priority. And when you do that, you lose your audience and you lose their trust. And if you lose their trust, you cannot help them. And our whole goal is to help the people as a free press. We're here to find information for you so you can fight for what you believe in. You live a very busy life. Your calling is not to be a journalist, but that doesn't mean you're not interested in the world around you. My calling is to be a journalist. Your calling is to do other things. You have a very busy and full life. My job is to support you in that so that you can live your purpose and you can also make decisions as a citizen. That's the job of the press, to support. We're a supporting role to you. We're not the main character. We should never be the main character. This is the problem with political endorsements. We're not the main character. What's more powerful? Think about this. Telling you what we think or giving you the best quality reporting to put you in a place that you may never go, to put you in front of a person you may never talk to give you access to information that you otherwise wouldn't have had access to. That's actually journalism. That's what we're supposed to do. I want to bring you to a place where you can feel like you're standing there. You can smell it. You can feel it. You get an impression of what that reality was like. It's not perfect all the time, but the goal is trying to do that for you so that you can chart your course. We're not advocates. We're reporters. There's a lot of roles in civil service that allow you to be advocates, but that's not journalism. And it's one of the reasons why the press has lost the trust of the people. And it's one of the reasons why the feeling of distrust of the press is not just superficial. It feels like a deep betrayal. Because if someone is robbing you of a certain perspective, they're taking away a little bit of your liberty to consider it. And that's really the crime. It's not just about, leaning one direction or the other. It's when I actually don't represent the other side and don't give you access to something different, I'm taking away your ability to consider it. And that's not freedom. That's not liberty. And that's what a free press constantly has to be focused on. The multiple sides of the story, just the basics, what's going on, why does it matter, who, what, where, when, how, and why. A few different opinions on it. The ability to go deeper if we need to, investigative work when we need to. And that work may ring alarm bells. That work may lead to resignation. That work may lead to actual cause and effects. But it happens that way because of the pressure of the people, not just because of the press. So the uproar over whether or not a newspaper endorses a candidate is surprising to me and not shocking. And I think a great example of where we are when it comes to the press in the United States. We're in a time of great creative disruption. It's what you're part of in Smarter News. We're building a solution in news. We're building a completely different path. 10 years ago, the thought of this sort of broadcast would just be like, what? In fact, I got that look. So I actually know that's true even 7 years ago. In fact, sometimes that look still comes to me. Might have even happened last week that people are like, what do you mean that you're going to just broadcast and you just, the people actually like, what is that? What is that even about? We're in a time of great creative disruption in the media. That's a time for amazing opportunity. And that's a great time where all different opposing viewpoints can actually clack into each other and bounce around and hopefully lead to more creative ideas and more freedom and more liberty. And that's what I hope to be a part of with Smarter News. So those are just my thoughts today as we ease on into Election Day and thinking a little bit more strategically about how the press can be helpful to the American people in a very real way. Wouldn't it be amazing? You just open so many different tabs on your computer and you're like, look at all these different independent, nonpartisan news sites. Wow, it's so awesome. I don't know. Who am I going to read today? I don't know. I think she's funny. I think we're going to go with her. That it could just be that. That's okay. And here's something else. One of the reasons why the political endorsements don't mean as much is because there's not that dividing line happening between reporting and op-ed. It is very clear that the Washington Post leans more left. So it's not shocking that the editorial page would want to endorse Vice President Harris. The way that we can get opinion to really be magnified, and that's where you can be challenged and you read great writing and you think about something different than before, is when the basics are covered well, where you can read a news story and it's very straightforward and you can think to yourself, what's my initial reaction to that story? And then you read an editorial that you think, I totally didn't think about it that way. That's amazing. Our editorial pages will be strong again when our reporting is fact-based and nonpartisan. The blending of these two together is where the real problem is. That dividing line that's been talked about so admirably in the past doesn't exist anymore. And we really have to be absolutely aggressive without surrender to keeping a nonpartisan independent reporting base so we can have strong editorial and commentary, because that's where that really can bloom. And that's great. That's where that's where freedom really also lies, is hearing all these different opinions. So I'm curious your thoughts on that.